Well, today on the show, I'm joined by Jon Perry. Together, Jon and I sit down to talk about evolutionary design. Before we begin, I want to read a quote from William Paley. William Paley was a very well-known, or is a very well-known natural theologian. He actually wrote a book called Natural Theology in 1806. And I've got here Richard Swinburne's Is There a God?, which has a great quote from William Paley all about the watchmaker analogy, which should set things up nicely for today's conversation. So bear with me now. In crossing a heath, supposed I pitched my foot against a stone, and were asked how the stone came to be here, I might possibly answer that, for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever, nor would it, perhaps, be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happens to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. Yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? Why is it not as admissible in the second case as in the first? For this reason, and for no other, that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive, what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, e.g., that they are formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day, that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, of a different size from what they are, or placed after any other manner, or in any other order than that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, or none which would have answered the use of that now served by it. The inference, we think, is inevitable, that the watch must have a maker, that there must have existed at some time and at some place or other, an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. I thought I'd start with that quote from William Paley within Richard Swinburne's Is There a God book, because it really helps to introduce this notion of a designer, somebody who has created the right gears, the right mechanisms for which something is ticking on. We look at something like a stone and we can see that that stone has come there by corrosion, by lava settling, hardening, by different settlement layers coming into existence, and by the general sort of reality of the natural world. But when you look at something like the hummingbird or the bee stinger, or any of these sorts of complicated bits of machinery that we see within the natural world, the question always arises, surely there's a creator or something that is overseeing such complex life, that is putting those cogs into the right place, into the right parts, so that these things can perform in the incredible ways that they do. There's another area which is kind of out of scope for this conversation, but I wanted to make sure that I mention here at the introduction, and that is cosmological fine-tuning. The idea that the universe itself, not just life on Earth, but the universe as a totality, has parameters that have been finely set to enable beings like ourselves to appear on planets like the planet Earth that we reside upon, and that this is also a sort of miraculous or a incredible event, incredible thing to be in existence. I won't go into the details. There are plenty of great podcasts and episodes that dive into the cosmological fine-tuning argument, but it is true that the parameters that preset the existence of natural life like ours are incredible and are ones to definitely go in and explore. But we're today interested in evolutionary life on planet Earth. Is it true that there's a watchmaker that's overseeing everything around us? Or are there naturalistic, materialistic processes that could explain the beginnings, abiogenesis, and then the rise and flood of life that we see today? Things like abiogenesis and evolutionary design, they posit stumbling blocks for the theist and the atheist alike. The theist claims that the world around us, it isn't possible without God. God has to be the watchmaker that has brought everything into existence. And then the naturalist or the atheist, very often they lose the jaw-dropping, incredible wonder that evolution should instill in each and every one of us. In preparing for this show, I've actually read 2 books by Richard Dawkins. The first one being The Blind Watchmaker, which goes into this argument from William Paley about a watchmaker bringing about causation, bringing about the makings and workings to enable life to come to the fore. And the second is Climbing Mount Improbable, again also by Richard Dawkins. And this one looks at how cumulative selection, piecemeal iterative steps forward bit by bit by bit, can produce extremely complicated, extremely incredible creatures, again like hummingbirds or the stinger of a bee. Joining me today to talk about evolution is Jon Perry. Jon has 2 great YouTube channels. He has Stated Clearly, which is a fantastic educational resource that goes into evolutionary biology, and also Stated Casually. Again, all about evolution, but a bit more of a sort of laid back, chilled approach. He's got some great kind of conversations on there as well, where he's had different guests to have on to ask some fascinating questions. There'll be links to Jon and to both of those channels in the description. There'll also be links to the books that I've mentioned. And if I can find 1 or 2 great videos on cosmological fine-tuning for those interested, I'll do my best as well to place that in the description. So yeah, listener, viewer, be sure to check those out. If it's your first time checking out the show, I'd ask you to hit the subscribe button. And then if you're on YouTube or Rumble, if you select the bell notification icon, that's going to remind you whenever we release a video here on the channel. And if you wouldn't mind sharing this with your friends, your family, your followers, we grow because you take the time to share the content. So please do share this conversation on evolutionary design with anyone who you think would benefit from it. Okay, we've got some great questions ready. I've got quite a few clips lined up as well to help us dive into some of the different facets and nuance of this conversation. And without any further ado, here is Jon Perry. Cheers. Hello and welcome to the show. My name's Samuel. Today I'm joined by Jon Perry. Jon, it's great to have you on the show.
It's good to be here. I'm excited about your new podcast.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's been a while since we last spoke. We spoke three times on the old show. And I thought it'd be really cool to get you back on to talk about evolutionary design with your brain and your knowledge. I'm very excited. I guess there will be a chunk of my audience who don't know who you are because this is a new podcast. Would you mind kind of giving people a little bit of a background to you and your work?
Yes. I run the Stated Clearly YouTube channel. I also have a second channel, Stated Casually. But Stated Clearly, my main channel, that's where I create teaching materials for teachers to use in the classroom. That's kind of my target audience. But of course, people just use them on YouTube randomly too. They're about genetics, chemistry, and evolution. And, that's when I'm not thinking about anything I have to think about, I'm usually thinking about evolutionary dynamics, like how it is that stuff that when organisms are evolving, how they interact with each other, how that evolution interacts, and the tangled mess of evolutionary change that happens. That's the thing that captures my mind. I love it. So, I do a lot of different types of videos there, about chemistry and so on, but the evolution stuff that's my wheelhouse. So
it's your baby.
Yeah.
So I guess to kind of frame it, I mean, I've done an introduction, but I thought it'd be also useful to kind of, I want to read a quote actually from The Blind Watchmaker, which I've read in preparation for the show, along with a few other books. And then I want to kind of frame this a little bit as well. I think there's a lot of confusion around evolution, especially between kind of theism and naturalism. There's sort of this big tension. So let's pull this quote up and read it, and we can kick off. So this is a quote from The Blind Watchmaker.
Yeah.
A true watchmaker has foresight. He designs his cogs and springs and plans their interconnections with a future purpose in his mind's eye. Natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind and no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker.
Yeah.
So a bit of scene setting then. So I had some family members over probably about 4 or 5 months ago, and they've since given birth. But one of my close relatives kind of, she was like about 7 months pregnant at the time, put a hand on her stomach and just said, I don't understand how anybody could doubt God's existence when you look at things like life coming into existence. And I guess this almost like really shocked me that people kind of almost kind of weave God into these sort of narratives at times, and just kind of claim that God is obviously evidence or evidentially there within the sort of makeup of the world around us. So I went on a sort of kind of quest, I guess, John, to kind of read things like The Blind Watchmaker and Climbing Mount Improbable, and I read on the origin of species, and kind of got myself into this framework where I want to really understand whether we can actually see a watchmaker, should we say, overriding everything, or whether life is kind of navigated and brought into fruition by a blind watchmaker. So I've got a whole host of questions to dive into that. But before I do, I think it'd be interesting to kind of hear a little bit from you about if you've kind of come into sort of any conflict in the work that you've done with talking about evolution and then having theists potentially trying to impose their beliefs over that sort of space.
Yeah, well, there's, I mean, obviously, when you teach evolution, you have a lot of people getting angry with you. I mean, even sometimes I'll go into classrooms and do things on evolution, and it's really interesting in the US. Like if I'm in the South, where was I? I was in South Carolina. And before I came in to do a lesson on evolution there in one of the classrooms, this was a middle school classroom, the teacher had to give the students notice ahead of time so their parents could give them a note to skip that class if they didn't want to learn about evolution. That was specific to that school. That's not like a statewide thing. That's a policy that school has, and it's only for middle school and high school. They do have to learn evolution, which is interesting. But there's a big conflict for a lot of people with evolution and their religious views. And, you see this online. If you just look at the comments underneath some of the evolution videos, it's just religious people and atheists fighting, and it's crazy. I mean, some people have like 10 accounts that you can tell it's the same person. I mean, people are ridiculous about these little fights that go on. So yeah, it's constant. This is a constant thing, and a lot of it, I think it's people see evolution. People kind of want this cosmic purpose, this higher power behind things. You mentioned the story about your family member who sees God in her pregnancy. I was recently in Ecuador, and my taxi driver, we were driving past a sunset, and he said, "Oh, praise God! Look at this beautiful sunset." And that's kind of similar, I would say. In his case, he didn't think that like the sunset is evidence of God. It sounds like your sister-in-law, your family member, thought that her pregnancy was evidence of God. He didn't think that God somehow built that sunset in like a sunset factory, right? He understands that there's light going through the the atmosphere that causes those crazy colors at an angle, but he believes that the creator is somehow underneath everything, and that they should be praised. The creator should be praised for the beautiful sunset. But a lot of people, they actually think that when it comes to biology, there was like the complexity in biology is actual evidence that there was God actually kind of maybe handcrafting is the wrong word, but actually building those things, they don't accept the evolutionary process. So that is very common when I'm teaching this, is for that conflict to come up. People do not want to believe that a blind watchmaker, this process of evolution, is what created this complexity. They want to think that there was a mind that directly designed these things that are complex that we see around us.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think as well, kind of if you begin to challenge theistic perspectives on evolution, they kind of just take a step back and just go, well, even if there isn't a kind of deity who is putting everything together and making something like, I think the two analogies I used in the introduction were the hummingbird and also the stinger of a bee, and we'll come to the stinger of a bee in due course with your work, John. But if there isn't a God deliberately putting these things together, then there's almost a God kind of putting out the blueprints for these things and kind of like pushing life into that direction again. So I think what I'm excited about today is to kind of unpick all this sort of complexity in this design, this evolution and God, and just kind of start from basics to present a video that I hope will help people to kind of go away and just think more holistically about this. Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Happy to help.
Thanks, dude. Yeah, I appreciate it. Okay, so let's really start from basics. So evolution. So should we define evolution as descent with modification acted upon by natural selection? And if we should define it like this, John, what does that even mean?
Yeah, we can define adaptive evolution that way. So evolution in general for biology would just be descent with modification. And that just means that when parents have offspring, those offspring are slightly different than the parents and slightly different than each other. That's descent with modification. And then when we talk about natural selection, which is when descent with modification is paired with natural selection, then we get adaptations to emerge. And natural selection is just very simple. It's just some of those differences that pop up, those heritable differences that pop up in offspring, those are they will happen to make some of those offspring better at surviving and reproducing than others, and maybe even better than the parents were at reproducing. And so over time, through this very simple process, you have reproduction with variation, heritable variation, and some of that heritable variation ends up being beneficial. Some of it ends up being bad. The bad stuff just gets weeded out. I mean, those who can't reproduce as well just don't reproduce as often. And those who can reproduce better reproduce more often. They leave more offspring. And so over time, that simple process, it causes adaptations to emerge. Things get better and better at surviving and reproducing within their specific environments. And so, yeah, that's a good definition for evolution that covers how adaptations emerge. Descent with modification acted upon by natural selection.
Nice. Okay. And that's really helpful. So I guess the way you're talking about natural selection there, then it kind of sounds like a almost like a scattergun approach. Like I would imagine that most things wouldn't get past any kind of adaptations that occur or modifications, sorry, that occur. Natural selection is going to probably remove the vast percentage of those, and only a few things will kind of get through. So is that what we're saying in natural selection is almost like a shotgun going off, and it just scatters pellets everywhere, and whichever ones stick, push forwards, and whichever ones don't stick, fall by the wayside?
Yeah. Well, you can think of mutation as this kind of shotgun process. So you've got lots of offspring, lots of mutations, and natural selection is this filter. It's only letting a couple of those variations through. So, yeah. I mean, it's this intense filtering process that's constantly happening, and we are the products of billions of years of that, and so we have these very complex adaptations, and we have lots of ways to prevent mutations and so on. So we have we minimize our chances of having offspring that are just going to fail. But yeah, the things that end up passing through that filter, it's very few.
Interesting. And I guess kind of one of the ways that kind of it often gets framed within the literature is this idea of sort of survival of the fittest, and this sort of seems to be this reality that it's far more easier to not be alive than it is to be alive, and that this obviously kind of this has a sort of impact on the direction and the changes that kind of evolution is able to instill within various kind of beings as they move from one stage to the next through kind of that reproductive evolutionary process. Kind of, is that a good way of defining sort of survival of the fittest, I guess?
Yeah, survival of the fittest is. There are some issues with that phrase in that it's a little bit confusing because it's actually more about reproduction. I mean, you have to survive in order to reproduce, obviously, but a lot of traits that are slightly deleterious is what we'd say is that they're slightly bad, they're slightly worse than the parental traits. You're not going to die if you have just a slightly bad mutation. But you're going to have fewer offspring. You're going to leave fewer offspring. So maybe a better way to say it is that those that are better at leaving offspring tend to leave more offspring. That's almost a better way to think about it. I mean, of course, there is death that happens there. So there's this survival thing that's going on. But yeah, those who happen to leave more offspring, happen to be better at leaving more offspring, tend to leave more offspring. And over time, you get this shift in the traits that a lineage has, that a population has. You mentioned there's so many more ways to not be alive than there are to be alive. And that's a very, very true statement. And it has a lot of implications for evolution. One of them being that the changes that end up being successful, they're usually very small changes. Evolution tends to be a very slow process. And we do see punctuations where evolution happens a lot faster than normal, but still it's over the course of, thousands and millions of years that these changes happen. Like if we look in the fossil record, you can see what looks like almost instantaneous changes, but those are actually over millions of years. So it's a very slow process, the process of evolution.
Do you think, kind of pointing at something like the variety of breeds of dog we have, obviously kind of they can still breed and have puppies currently, and eventually maybe there'll be sort of kind of some sort of lineages of dogs that aren't able to interbreed anymore, and then we kind of push into other species eventually. We can look at kind of the dogs and how really it's only been the last kind of few thousand years that we've been purposefully trying to breed various kind of characteristics within dogs. Many theists would look at something like a dog and different dog breeds and kind of say, like, obviously that is possible, that's kind of clear as day, but it's the sort of longer timescales and the more possibilities at those timescales and still that kind of become quite daunting. Like, how do we begin to even kind of picture that space?
You're talking about like the length of time?
For evolution involved to actually kind of like bring about literally new species.
I mean, evolutionary time is extremely long. We've got, it's billions of years. We think that life started over 3 billion years ago. It's a very, very long time. But evolutionary time also has width to it, that as organisms reproduce, you've got a big population, all the organisms are evolving in parallel. So you've got population size plus the length of time. So evolutionary time actually has volume. And then you have the in organisms that reproduce sexually, there's a lot of crossover that happens. So there's combinations of different lineages that can come together and form new phenotypes as well. So there's a lot that evolution has to work with. We can see just with dogs, like how dramatic the changes are. I did a calculation once to figure out, like, if you compare the smallest dog breeds to the largest dog breeds, if you had a person, like if I represented the smaller dog breeds, like a teacup Chihuahua, and you represented, I think the I can't remember what dog breed it is. It's the biggest. I think it's the Mastiff, but you would be like 32 feet tall compared to me. So there's huge variation that we've seen in dog breeds, and we've really only been breeding dogs like intentionally for the past couple hundred years. We've had dogs, we've been domesticating them for several, I think maybe it's like 20 to 30,000 years that we've been living with dogs and keeping them as companions. So over a very short period of time, we've had dramatic shifts in phenotype. We dramatically changed these animals from their wolf ancestors. And if you just, that's just a couple thousand years. Think about the millions of years and the billions of years of evolutionary time, and the changes can be absolutely dramatic. There are a couple of things that, when we look at domestic plants and animals compared to wild plants and animals, there are some things that are different. I mean, it's pretty rare for really big changes to be selected for in nature. I was just mentioning this, that the switches and the things that are selected for, they tend to be small changes. In dog breeds, that's not necessarily the case, because dog breeders get excited when there's a big change, and it's like people get excited when they can see a difference, and so they'll breed that one dog a lot. So you get pretty quick and dramatic changes. But there are times in evolutionary history where this sort of abrupt change can happen as well. So right after a big catastrophe, where you have the extinction of the dinosaurs, for example, right after that we see a big shift in mammals. We call this an adaptive radiation, where mammals are spreading and adapting super fast to a bunch of new evolutionary different niches that they can survive in. And that rapid evolutionary change is kind of on par to what you see with dogs and their evolution since domestication, where it's just really fast. Different organisms are finding themselves in very different environmental conditions, and they're adapting rapidly to those. So I don't know, I might have trailed off there, but
no, it's cool. I mean, it kind of sounds like you're pushing a little bit into kind of speciation as well. I don't know whether you can kind of talk about that and these sort of kind of concentrated periods of evolutionary change during times of upheaval, and kind of contrasting that with sort of kind of, I guess, stagnation in sort of different species history, like how that all fits together.
So when you say stagnation, are you talking about when evolutionary change slows down?
Yeah, or it appears to stop, or at least kind of drastically slow down for a while, and then kind of picks back up again after a bit.
Yeah, most organisms that we see right now are in stasis, is what we call evolutionary stasis. And so you're still getting a lot of genetic change. Every generation you have mutations and so on. But these organisms are highly optimized for the environment that they live in. They're very optimized. They're at the top of what we call a fitness peak. So when an organism is at the top of a fitness peak, almost any evolutionary change that'll happen ends up being bad, because they're very optimized for their phenotype, for that environment that they're living in. I'm trying to think of a good example of this. The nautilus, you know what the nautilus is? This kind of like octopus-looking thing that has a shell.
Yeah.
They have an eye that is a pinhole eye. They don't have a lens in their eye. They've got a pinhole eye, and it turns out that eye is at a fitness peak that's suboptimal for vision. Having a pinhole eye lets you see pretty well, because you're without going into how optics work, just it works well, but it doesn't work as well as having an eye that's covered and has a lens inside. But there's this thing that happens when you're at a little fitness peak like they are, where if you were to have skin suddenly cover that eye that's somewhat transparent, skin that could then eventually evolve into a lens, that's going to be a disadvantage for the first organism that has that skin covering because it's not perfectly transparent. And so they're going to have a reduction in vision temporarily. Now, that could in the future lead to a dramatic increase in vision because you could get that lens to evolve from that covering. But there's going to be that temporary sink in fitness. And that is a problem for them because they're competing with their rivals, which have a really nice, fully functioning pinhole eye. And so they're going to be doing better. Most organisms are at a peak like this that it prevents evolutionary change from happening. You are getting an increase in genetic diversity in a population that's constantly increasing, but the phenotype actually doesn't change much when a population is stuck on a fitness peak like this. And you need some sort of a change in the environment, some sort of dramatic change that allows evolutionary exploration to happen again. So one thing that could happen is you could have a big catastrophe that opens up a bunch of niches and lets the population spread out and explore different niches. And individuals are not really competing so much because there's tons of opportunity, tons of resources available. And so they can spread and grow. And that's one way that you can get evolution to overcome this hump. And you can kind of think of that as the fitness peak gets flattened out. Another way that this can happen is you could have like the introduction of a parasite, for example, maybe a parasite that can get into the eye, that eye hole, and then eat the inside of eat the retina and cause problems that way. In a situation like that, an individual born with a slight covering over the eye, they would suddenly have an advantage. Even though they can't see as well, they're not susceptible to that parasite, and so they have an advantage. And then from there, evolution could start producing a lens from that covering. So there are lots of ways that lineages will get stuck on these fitness peaks, and their evolutionary change it'll stop. It'll go into stasis. And then there are lots of ways that stasis can get removed. And you can have, again, rapid evolutionary change, rapid in comparison to the long period of stasis that we see.
That's really interesting. You've mentioned phenotypes a couple of times. Would you mind just kind of diving into what a phenotype is?
Yeah, a phenotype is just the way that your body is formed. So you have a genotype, which is the genes that you have, and then the phenotype, which is the effect of those genes, basically. So the actual shape of your body. There are genes that help code for your teeth, and then there are your actual teeth, the actual shapes of those teeth. So that's the genotype and then the phenotype.
That's helpful. I've in the past thought of it as almost like a sort of a kind of like a car factory. There's a computer, has a blueprint of a car, and then there's loads of machines putting the car together, and the end result is the sort of car that's kind of based off the blueprint. Very simplistic example, but there you go.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, and the biologists are really they separate those two things because the genotype and the phenotype of a population can evolve at different time scales. The genotype, the gene pool is actually constantly changing. It's constantly evolving. So there's constant change kind of under the hood, I guess you could say. But the actual phenotype, it can be stabilized for a long period of time because natural selection is favoring this one specific phenotype. So even if the genes are shifting under the hood, the phenotype is staying the same.
Interesting. And I guess kind of, I want to talk about sort of cumulative selection as well. Kind of a lot of people might hear what you said about the sort of that sort of kind of pinhole eye, and then you have the issue kind of a parasite eating away at the retina, and then sort of a lens comes about, and then kind of that is a good adaptive kind of next step forwards, and that then becomes kind of more and more prevalent within a sort of species. People might hear things like that and kind of think, oh, that's just chance. And I guess chance is just kind of dictating how things go and how things move around. I kind of would like to kind of dive into why this idea of chance isn't really correct, and what this idea of kind of cumulative selection does in kind of replacing chance almost, or utilizing things in a slightly different, more nuanced way.
Mm-hmm. Well, evolution, the process of evolution is part chance and then part selection. So you have, it's basically it's tinkering. This blind watchmaker is a tinkerer, right? So there's lots of variation, tons of variation, and that we can say is chance. That's chance variation. So descent with modification, that's basically a chance process. But then you get selection that happens, and so some of these changes are going to be slightly beneficial, and those will be favored. They're going to cause an increase in that organism's ability to get food, to avoid predators, and therefore it's going to increase their ability to leave more offspring than their competitors. And over time, over many, many generations, all of these benefits accumulate, and all of the negative mutations, they end up disappearing. They get outcompeted. So you get this accumulation of very slight increases in fitness over evolutionary time. And so, yes, you do have chance that's involved in evolution, but also you have this cumulative selection process that lets all those little lucky wins add up into, in some cases, very complicated adaptations and very sophisticated adaptations. It's just a very long, slow trial and error design process that's happening in evolution.
Yeah, and I guess there's like a really interesting sort of kind of I guess trade-off, or maybe a playoff is a better way of saying it. Like if we look at something like a sort of peacock's kind of fan, sort of male peacock's got a very kind of broad, beautiful fan at the back of his back tail, and there's this thing which is obviously kind of having pressure to be kind of bred in because the females think it's attractive. But at the same time, there's a sort of survival element where if it's too long, it's going to drag. They're not going to be able to escape predators. There's going to be a sort of kind of apex, or at least a sort of kind of sectional space where this is too big, this is too small and not pretty enough, and this is sort of the prime area, or the apex, whatever term we want to use. And these two things are going to be consistently fighting, where a male is going to keep going through different generations, getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger with its tail, and then eventually that's not going to work, so therefore kind of wind it back a bit. I think this sort of space is absolutely fascinating within evolutionary history. So would you mind just diving into that a little bit for us?
You want me to talk about the interplay between sexual selection and natural selection in general?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So in the case of the peacock, yes, males are competing for females. In the case of the peacock, the male does not help in parental care, so the female is looking for good genes. Basically, that's all she's getting from the male is good genes, and the plumage on a peacock's tail, and this is true of all, like, pheasants and the things that are related to peacocks, this, all the way to turkeys and stuff. They show off their tail feathers, and in some pheasants they're showing off their wing feathers as well. But what we see evolving in these males are feathers that are very hard to take care of, so that you have these really bright blues in the peacock's tail, and these eye spots and stuff, these really cool designs in the tail. Those are very difficult to make. And so if a male is malnourished, he can't do it. If a male is really struggling and sick, his tail looks like garbage. And so it's very easy for the female to basically spot an unfit male, and she's going to choose the more fit male to mate with. So there's this competition between males to have the most, like, impressive looking tail, right? And that bumps up against their need to survive. And so, yeah, you have basically with peacocks, what's ended up shaking out is this huge tail. And that means that those males are very, very fit. Not only can they make a living, they can grow this huge tail and still grow to adulthood and still be around to impress a female. And that's just a sign to that female that this individual is extremely fit. If I mate with this individual, my daughters will be fit because the father was fit, and my sons will be fit, and they'll be able to impress females and find mates as well. So there's this constant trade-off between finding a mate and surviving. And evolution is always playing with trade-offs. There's always these trade-offs that exist in nature.
I want to invite you to join our community on Locals. There is a range of free and supporter-only benefits to check out. On Locals, you can ask guest questions, access the reading plan to prepare for upcoming conversations, get early access to all the full-length video and audio versions of each episode, and meet like-minded followers of the show. The link is in the description, and I hope to see you there. It's really interesting. And I guess the first point I kind of want to just really hammer home to the listener is this idea of sort of imperfections and mutations almost serving as evidence for the evolutionary process rather than a sort of what you'd expect under a sort of theistic guiding hand, which is an aggregation towards perfection. You've already mentioned, John, that various sort of kind of species can be at the top of their game in their certain area, in the certain environments that we have. And we look at something like the end of the dinosaurs via the kind of comet that hit Earth, and then you kind of have this dust incineration cloud going around Earth, and all the large species basically being wiped out, and then kind of like a fair few years later, mammals kind of pop back into existence, and then it blew up, and it is now the sort of time of the mammal. There doesn't seem to be a perfect design that's going to be able to survive all situations and all scenarios. There seems to be the push towards species being at the top of their game in their environment currently, and then, as you already said, that environment changes and things shift. Is there anything that I said that was incorrect in that, John? I think that's a good point to just hammer in.
No, that's really good. Actually, it's kind of fun to explore that specific extinction event, because it's one that we know a lot about. Like we are now very, very confident that the dinosaurs went extinct because of this asteroid impact. It looks like all of our models of it and stuff suggest that asteroid, it would have caused a cloud that probably it stopped photosynthesis for at least 2 years. So there was basically all the plants they were killed by this cloud. So we had this nuclear winter after the impact. So all of the herbivores that depended on those plants for 2 years, they had no food, so they died off. Basically, the things that survived that were, you had birds who could fly to whatever little areas still somehow had food, and mammals survived it, probably because there were some that were burrowing animals, and they were eating fungus, and they were eating maybe also the roots of plants. A lot of plants go dormant in a situation like this, just like they go dormant in the winter. So they would still have roots available to be eaten. So somehow mammals, several groups of mammals survive this, several groups of birds survive this, several groups of reptiles survive this, but the big dinosaurs, they all went extinct. What that means is that, coming out of this, the world is like empty. And so once these plants start turning back on, start photosynthesizing again, start producing all this food, there's just an abundance everywhere. And so all of these mammals that used to be competing extremely hard just to survive, they were at carrying capacity before. So every environment has a carrying capacity. It can only support so many individual organisms. Well, all of a sudden you've got a ton of food once photosynthesis kicks back in, and all of the competition is just relaxed. And so there's population explosions of every lineage that survived that extinction event. And during that time, there's all this, it's so much easier for evolution to explore more routes, because even fairly big mutations that might really mess you up in some ways, but give you benefits in other ways, those mutations, they can stick around. You can have, just like some of these big mutations that we see in dog breeds, like the one that we have for wiener dogs, that makes them really short and long. That mutation also gives them back problems. So it's a disadvantage, but the advantage that it gives them is it lets them hunt underground. And so the reason that we have wiener dogs is because they were really good at hunting rabbits and other things that burrow. And so people kept them around. Well, a mutation that big, all of a sudden, would not usually be selected for in nature, because it causes these back problems as well. But after a big extinction event, something like that could survive, because there's not a lot of competition. There's tons of opportunities. And so you have that one mutation that causes a dramatic change, but also causes problems. And then you have time for other mutations to come and help fix some of those problems that the big one caused. And you can actually get that sort of rapid evolution to happen, even though it causes problems. So anyway, these big extinction events are really cool, because you have these rapid, we call them radiation events, where you get these rapid speciation events that happen rapid in evolutionary time, caused by those catastrophes.
Yeah, I do find the extinction of the dinosaurs to be fascinating. The asteroid hitting and this gas cloud, or this sort of kind of debris flying into the atmosphere and kind of coating the Earth for a good few years. I mean, the reality was it's also superheated as well. So from what we can tell, it was almost acted like a grill over the surface of the Earth. So kind of like large things, breathing was difficult, finding food was difficult, and also it's extremely hot. So they kind of, some of them did just slowly burn to death. And anyway, it's crazy.
Oh yeah,
Crazy.
you have the heat originally, which I think it's been a while since I looked at those models, but I think almost the entire Earth got blasted with a heat wave. And then you have the cloud, which stops the sun from getting in. So the heat wave is then followed by a big freeze. So it's like, if you can't dig or fly to get to try and find a place that's safer, you're kind of screwed. So it's not a surprise that this caused a mass extinction.
Yeah.
It's a very, very tough time to survive.
Yeah, and there's been 5 in total, which is crazy. I mean, there's actually just to kind of finish on this point. There's a really cool documentary series that's accessible on Netflix. It's probably accessible in a few other places, called "Life on Our Planet." It's based on a few others, Life on the Universe, etc. And it's all narrated by Morgan Freeman. But it literally goes through like how the Earth greened and kind of how things came about in the ocean, and how kind of animals came out of the ocean onto the land, and how some that went back into the ocean, and then we had these kind of 2 diverse areas, and yeah, it goes through all the extinction events, all the different sort of animals that we're aware of currently, and it goes through, there's a whole episode on sort of the dinosaurs being wiped out. And I was watching it with my 2 kids, and we're all sat there like almost crying. It was incredible, like how crazy this sort of event was.
Oh yeah, I mean, the dramas that have unfolded, just that when you try to think about evolutionary time, I mean, it's impossible to understand what a billion years is, or what 200,000, or even what 200,000 years is. It's crazy for us to think about. I mean, we think of ancient as being like when the pyramids were built, or when Jesus walked. The story of Jesus is 2,000 years ago. That seems so ancient, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands. We're talking about millions. We're talking about billions of years of evolutionary time. And it's insane to try to understand this, and just to think about all of the dramas. I mean, all of the struggle for existence that's just constantly going on, things battling for life, all of the relationships that would develop between animals, like we see today, like badger and the coyote that like to team up when they hunt. There's all these cool little relationships that pop up, and just think of all those relationships throughout the history of this planet. It's just it's so fun to think about. Like, just, and it's impossible for us to fully grasp the meaning of this, and to grasp the breadth of the suffering that's happened, and the breadth of the the successes and the failures. It's just really cool to think about this.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I want to keep diving into a few things. I mean, we've kind of touched on the sort of big pillars now, so we're going to be just kind of pushing a little bit further in to make sure we haven't missed anything, or we're definitely covering as many areas as I can think of. So I guess I want to talk a little bit more about evolutionary arms races, and we've kind of spoken about different things previously, but I think the sort of idea of a sort of cheetah and gazelle is quite helpful because people can picture that quite easily in their head. You know, on the savannah somewhere, there's this sort of gazelles grazing, and a cheetah comes along, and she's trying to kill a gazelle to feed her young. And obviously, that's kind of modern day, but kind of you just wind these species back bit by bit by bit by bit, and you'll see them getting kind of almost worse in different ways.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting that these things have kind of utilized each other to evolve into certain directions. So John, would you mind kind of chatting about evolutionary arms races?
Yes, in an evolutionary arms race, you have you have the predator and the prey. In this case, when the predator evolves and gets a little bit better at hunting, that puts evolutionary pressure on the prey animal to get better at avoiding that predator. And so these things are evolving, they're co-evolving, and they exaggerate each other's traits, like, to the absolute max. So the cheetah and the gazelle are great examples of this, because you've got some of the fastest animals on the planet. They're so good. The cheetah is so good at hunting, at chasing down an animal, and the gazelle is so good at running away from a cheetah. I think it's the gazelle that lives with the cheetah, but the these arms races are just that. It's just like, I mean, it's named after the arms races that happened during war. If you watch, man, I went to the there's an airplane museum here, like in Canada, and it goes over the museum. You look at airplane designs from the first one, and then you see just very minimum progress in airplane design, and then you see World War One, and it's insane. Like, we go from these little fabric airplanes to metal airplanes, that can fly through fire, and just, they're incredible death machines. And then you see things kind of go silent. The progress slows down again, and then there's World War II, and then bam, you have this huge explosion in airplane innovation. And that same thing happens in evolution. When you have different species competing for the same thing, or competing for survival against each other, they will drive each other's evolution like nothing else. So that's an evolutionary arms race. One way to think about it too is like, yesterday's edge is today's necessity. Like, whatever adaptation gave you that edge as a hunter in the past, well, now your prey has adapted to that. And so now you have to at least have that to even get any food. So you have this crazy advancement that's triggered by these evolutionary arms races.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's consistently pushing one thing forward, isn't it, in a very special way, I guess. And obviously, this is all being fueled by DNA. We've already spoken about that, and kind of people like to use kind of fluffy language, like talk about kind of like fire or the spark of life or all this sort of stuff. But it'd be really good just to be kind of really, really clear, kind of what role DNA plays within organisms, kind of according to, I guess, modern biological theories. Like, what is it that DNA is doing behind the scenes?
Yeah, DNA is often talked about as like the information molecule of life, and all that means is that DNA is this. It's a chain like molecule with a bunch of different monomers, and those monomers can be in any pattern, any possible pattern. and DNA can be replicated, so that pattern can be copied from parent to offspring. So when we talk about information in biology, we're talking about the pattern, so the heritable pattern. So DNA is at the basement of heritability. It's got the information that is passed from parent to child. And again, what we mean by information is just the sequence of DNA nucleotides that are in that molecule. So yeah, information is at the heart of biology. And when you have reproduction, what's being reproduced, you could think of it this way: it's that information. It's the pattern of the parent had a good pattern that allowed that parent to survive and reproduce, and it passes that pattern, that information, on to the offspring. And that's what's evolving.
And it's kind of incredible to think that we are all basically kind of like temporal DNA hosts that are just basically here to propagate from our fathers and mothers onto kind of offspring, and then they'll kind of carry this lineage forwards. And we kind of then think about kind of humans and the society we have and the friendships we have, and the fact that we created money and we kind of conquered the world and all these sorts of like things that we've done, created societies, etc. That all of this is coming about because there is something innate within us that is driving us forwards to replicate, essentially, and to push ourselves into the future. Yeah. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that sort of kind of spin on DNA, Jon.
Yeah, well, I think some people find this to be disturbing, that the purpose of life, you could say, is to pass your genes on to the next generation. That's the purpose of life. I mean, that's what we've evolved to be good at. That's what we're being selected for. Some people find that to be depressing. I just find that to be it's just a fact of our evolutionary history. But yeah, to do all that, I mean, the weird ways that we've found, different organisms have found to pass their genes on. Dandelions just make these puffy little seeds that float on the wind. That's how they do it. We, we make podcasts. That's one way that we do it. So it's there's so many weird ways to make a living, so many weird ways to pass your genes on to the next generation. And there's this beautiful drama, this tangled mess of life, all these different organisms that at the heart, they're all the same thing. They're all DNA spreading machines, but they're all doing it in such different and weird and interesting ways. It's amazing to think about.
I've never really thought about this podcast being my Peacock fan, but there you go. Maybe it is.
Well, hopefully you'll eventually start making a profit off of this, which you'll be using to support your children. So yes, this podcast, if all goes well, will help you spread your genes, help ensure that your genes are solid into the future.
That's fantastic. I love that. Okay, so I guess I want to talk about this idea of kind of evolution taking a step back down. We use the term sort of mountain. I've just read Climbing Mount Improbable. This idea of evolution taking a step back to then go to a different peak or to go somewhere else. I think a lot of people think that evolution should be able to do this, but it seems apparent that this isn't a function that evolution is able to perform. We've kind of spoken about the squashing effect and the sort of from like kind of cataclysmic events, and things can go off in crazy directions from that, but things don't step backwards from their mountain to go up to a new sort of step back from their peak to go up a new peak, as far as I can tell. But how do you kind of go about explaining this sort of concept, Jon?
So you were reading the Blind Watchmaker, and one of the big messages in that book is that evolution is not planning for the future, not at all. I mean, it's wherever a lineage is right now, it's just going to take the next step in whatever direction happens to be beneficial. It's just one step at a time. There's no foresight. There's no prediction of what the future is going to be like. And so this is one of the reasons I brought up the Nautilus eye, that pinhole eye, which is, it's really good at seeing, but it's not as good as it could be if it had a lens. But to evolve a lens, first you need a covering over your pinhole eye, and that's a disadvantage. It's impossible for a population that's competing, all these organisms are competing for survival and reproduction, competing against each other. It's impossible for evolution to take that step back because it has no foresight unless the environment changes. So that's the only way that you can take what looks like a step back, is actually the fitness landscape has to change. And I gave the example, one thing that could cause that fitness landscape to change is some sort of parasite that can get into that pinhole eye and cause problems. Another thing that could change that fitness landscape is a mass extinction event elsewhere that opens up a bunch of different niches. And so individuals are spreading rapidly and they're not actually competing with each other so intensely anymore. And then a mutation that causes a big disadvantage, just genetic drift. I mean, maybe it just won't matter because there's not very intense competition. So those are the ways that evolution can take a step back. You can't actually travel down a fitness peak. The fitness peak has to get flattened, and then you can travel up a new way after it's been flattened. But there's some really nice images. There's a Wikipedia article. I can't remember. It was I think it's just fitness landscapes. But I sent you a couple of these images where it shows these fitness landscapes. And one of the fitness landscapes that it's showing these fitness peaks coming and rising and falling. And you see populations evolving to go up one fitness peak, and then that peak falls, and now they're at the bottom. And so they evolve up a different fitness peak. And this is how evolution can, just this blind process of evolution can actually get dramatic change to happen again. It's how you get unstuck from a fitness peak.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I'll make sure those are both linked in the show notes. I have them up here if you want me to pull them up at any point, but just give me a shout. It'd be interesting, I think, so we kind of talk about eyes a lot, and then kind of Climbing Out Improbable, which is the sort of most recent one of Dawkinson's book that I read. He goes on about eyes quite a lot, and lenses and those sorts of things, kind of why lenses evolved and things, and how there's at the time that he wrote this in the sort of early 90s, there were sort of 60 different separate evolutionary trains or series of events that have caused eyes to develop in sort of different ways. And kind of, obviously kind of a few hundred years ago, the eye was like an incredible thing. People like evolution can't make sense when Darwin came out, because the eye is so complicated. I think Darwin even talks about the eye himself being kind of so complicated that it almost baffles the mind. But then, kind of people think that you need to have all these different things like your retina, your lens, etc., the sort of transparent fluid all at once to have this thing come together. I guess a lot of people think that there needs to be this sudden jump from no eye to eye, and that coming about is so improbable, it's incredible. But as we've already mentioned, these sort of slow cumulative effects through kind of natural selection, applying pressure, are going to enable certain things to win out and certain things to fall by the wayside. I don't know, is there anything else we want to say on this idea of kind of like massive changes having to happen at once versus these slow, gradual steps? I guess it's one that I hear brought up time and time again online, so I'm trying to make sure we really nail it down.
Yeah. Well, just to be clear, you cannot get a complex adaptation to happen all in one step. It has to happen gradually. And people oftentimes, when you look at an eye, for example, it's like, how could this have evolved? There's so many different parts, and you think they all have to be there together for it to work. But that's not true, because, well, in the land of the blind, he with one eye is king, right? And in the land of the blind, in evolutionary terms, the individual with a slightly functioning eye spot is better than the one with no functioning eye spot. And Darwin actually wrote about this in his first book on evolution. He presented the eye, explained how difficult it is to explain, and then he actually, using comparative anatomy, he showed actually there is a pathway for this to evolve, and he showed a bunch of well, he gave us a very loose sketch, but since then we've put together a really nice evolutionary pathway for the evolution of our own eye, using, well, some of what we know from the fossil record, but a lot of what we know from comparative anatomy, what different eyes would have looked like at different stages. There would have been a lensless stage where you have a retina that can detect light, but it's you're not getting a focused image, and that's better than no image at all. And then, eventually you get gradually the evolution of the eye. In that case, you're actually selecting for vision the entire time. So you start with a photoreceptive protein, and bacteria have these. Then you get to eye spots in animals. So there's a cluster of cells that have a lot of these photoreceptor proteins in them. And then you go from there to a little cup type organ that's got all these photoreceptive cells in it, to a deep cup, and then a ball, and then with a pinhole, and then eventually you get a lens, and so on. So these things can evolve gradually, basically because, as I said, in the land of the blind, he with one eye is king. So that's pretty easy to explain just through natural selection, selecting for better and better vision over time. But there are other structures that are harder to explain. Structures like the bacterial flagellum, right? There's been a lot of people talking about that. People claim that it could not evolve because it's got multiple parts that they say have to all be working together in order to get swimming in bacteria. And the key there is that the flagella was not always used to swim. Things like the flagella exist in bacteria that they use just for, you have these little tentacles that bacteria use to stick to surfaces. And at one point, we have these evolutionary models for the bacterial flagella. At one point, the flagella was being used most likely just to stick onto surfaces. And eventually a spinning proton pump ended up being associated with it. These proton pumps, cells have lots of proton pumps inside of them. A lot of these proton pumps move. If one of those happened to be associated with this outgrowth, you would get that outgrowth to move or pulsate a little bit. And then from there, you can get selection for full-on swimming. So here we have a zigzag in evolutionary history. We call this exaptation, where there's a trait that evolved for one function, and then there's a new evolutionary pressure or a new opportunity arises, and it switches function and now evolves for a second function. And you have this zigzagging motion in the evolutionary history of that trait. And that's one of the things that allows these really complex structures to evolve.
That's a nice little tease. We're going to get to Destin from Smarter Every Days. He's got a video on this in due course. So
Right. Yeah.
Just hang fire and we can dive into this further because it's a fascinating space to explore.
Right.
I just want to talk one more time about co-evolution. An example of co-evolution I've kind of come across and been fascinated by is the idea of bees and flowers, and how there are certain sort of bees that only work with certain sort of flowers, and it's just we sort of look at flowers and think these are beautiful, these must have been placed here for mammals like us, but then we're kind of not aware of the sort of kind of light sources that kind of bees are utilizing to see flowers, ultraviolets, etc. And these flowers look completely different to bees, look far more attractive, and just a completely different landscape. So would you mind just talking a little bit about co-evolution? You can use bees and flowers if you want, or another example.
Yeah, well, bees and flowers are great because, you've got, bees aren't the only pollinators, of course. There's lots of animals from birds to pretty much all kinds of different insects that are pollinators. And what you have is plants are trying to reproduce, and a lot of plants just use the wind to spread their pollen. And the wind is super inefficient. It just sprays the pollen everywhere. So these plants are producing tons of pollen, and some of that pollen will eventually get to another plant and pollinate that plant. And early on in the evolution of pollinating insects, you just have bugs that are eating pollen. Pollen is high in nutrition. It's basically the plant's sperm. So there's a lot of protein in there. There's a lot of nutrients in that. So you've got these bugs that are just eating pollen. And sometimes when a bug is eating pollen, it'll get some of that pollen stuck on its body. And when it goes to the next plant to eat its pollen as well, it's going to get some of that pollen onto the female reproductive parts of that plant. And so it's going to fertilize that plant. Well, any plant that happens to attract these pollen-eating insects more efficiently than other plants, it's more likely to get pollinated. So you have, there's a problem with a pollen eater. It's eating your pollen, but also it's bringing pollen from other plants to you, and so there's also a benefit there. And if it happens to be that pollen eater is less dangerous, is causing less harm. Sorry, how can I word this? I mean, you have to produce a bunch of pollen to spread by the wind because it's so inefficient. You also have to produce a lot of pollen if there's something eating your pollen. But it turns out that in most cases, you have to produce less to feed a pollinator than you do to spread through the wind. So there's a selection pressure to just attract pollen eaters. There's also a selection pressure to feed them something easier to make than pollen, because pollen is a difficult thing for a plant to make. It takes a lot of that plant's resources. Nectar that plants produce, it's very easy for plants to make. It's just sugar. Sugar is what they make through photosynthesis. Plants are super good at making sugar. So if you also just kind of tease the animal with some sugar, fill it up on sugar so it doesn't eat all your pollen, you can actually avoid getting so much of your pollen eaten, and that insect is going to want to come to that plant more often because, man, there's all kinds of snacks here. There's pollen I can eat. There's sugar I can eat. This is awesome. Well, you also get the evolution of flowers from this. Flowers are just signals. They're advertising, hey, I've got pollen and I've got sugar. Come get it. And that can evolve because anything that the insect is using to recognize that plant, like, oh, that plant was good. That plant had sugar and had pollen. I want to try and find one of those again. Anything weird about that plant that insect noticed, if that can be exaggerated, if any mutation exaggerates that trait, that plant is going to be better at attracting those insects than its competitors that don't have that exaggeration. And so a flower is just a dramatic exaggeration of something that bugs noticed in the past, when they were at a plant that they liked. So you have this coevolution that happens. The plant is getting better at attracting insects, and the insects are getting better at finding those plants that have what they want, that have the nectar and have the pollen. And you have this coevolution happening, and flowers emerge from that crazy process.
Yeah, it's incredible, isn't it? It really is. Absolutely fascinating. I want to push forward. I'm aware that there's so much more that can be said on all these things. So for the sake of time, I think it'd be good to move to a few new bits. The first bit I want to do, actually, I'm going to share my screen briefly. Let me find the right section. Okay, so this is a quote that I posted on YouTube. It's from Climbing Mount Improbable, which is a book by Richard Dawkins, and the quote says, "It's grindingly, creakingly, crashingly obvious that if Darwinism were really a theory of chance, it couldn't work. You don't need to be a mathematician or a physicist to calculate that an eye or a hemoglobin molecule would take from here to infinity to self-assemble by sheer higgledy-piggledy luck. So this is like a very kind of classic Dawkins-esque quote, but
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to kind of dive into this a little bit because there's a comment on here by, it's actually a really, really good friend of mine, but also a theist, which I want to kind of read out as well, because I think this is the sort of classic rebuttal that, or the classic statement that theists would pose, right? And for those listening, the sort of comment goes, agree thus far. However, it's an interesting quote given Richard Dawkins's professed atheistic belief. Makes me wonder what he's leading to say next that would explain why this doesn't challenge his atheism. So I guess this is a question, John, really about the differences between chance and God. Theists claim that evolution has to either be based on chance or luck, or it has to be overseen by a God. There seems to be this sort of dichotomy that's always presented. Could you chat us through one more time about this sort of false dichotomy?
Yeah, well, I mean, Dawkins he's talking about that to say that, evolution is not a process, it's not just luck, it's the evolutionary process. You do have these chance events, these chance mutations that create variation, but that variation is filtered through natural selection. And that process, descent with modification, which is, you could say, is a chance thing, acted upon by selection, that is a creative process. It is a natural creative process. So that's what he's arguing there. I think a lot of theists, this has just been true since the origin of Darwin's thinking, since he first started publishing his book, his thoughts on this. A lot of people have really struggled, like, how can nature be so creative? Because obviously organisms are extremely, like, beautifully designed, right, for surviving in their specific environments. How can nature do this? Darwin pointed it out. The process is so simple that people have trouble believing it or accepting it. But it really does work. It really, really works. And why it is that so you're asking, are you asking why Christians have rejected that?
I mean, that might be an interesting one to explore, for sure. I guess I'm just trying to dive into this dichotomy where it's either all chance or it's all God. It's almost like they can't understand that, as we've already said, it's kind of chance pushed through this sort of filters we said of natural selection. They kind of, I think they almost can't see natural selection as anything other than God's filter. But then when you look at natural selection, given like we've already mentioned the sort of the extinction of the dinosaurs quite a few times here, but against cataclysmic events, you kind of begin to go, this isn't like a theistic framework. This is something that's very, very blind, as we've already said repeatedly. So I don't know, take it in whichever direction you want, John.
Yeah. Well, I think when people make claims like that, like your friend did there, he probably doesn't understand the process of evolution. That when people say that it's just a chance thing, they're ignoring the process of evolution. They're thinking somehow that the eye just popped into existence or the flagellum just popped into existence. That's not what happened. These are evolved structures. They have a long evolutionary history, this long history of trial and error production through this natural process of evolution. So basically they're just rejecting it, maybe because they don't understand it, or maybe because they're refusing to listen to it. They don't want to listen to it for some reason. I don't think that's necessary. There's a lot of Christians who don't have an issue with evolution. Going back to my friend who thanked God for the sunset, again, he doesn't think that God handcrafted that sunset. He understands that there's a whole process, a physical process that creates sunsets, but he believes that God is somehow behind that all. And there are a lot of Christians that think about evolution that way. Of course, evolution is a natural process, but they think that God is behind everything in some way. And that's that's a type of thinking or type of theology that, I don't think is really in conflict with science. They're not trying to put themselves in conflict with science. You have this other way of thinking where, no, we think that God specifically designed the eyeball. It's like, I don't know, people are imagining some like Santa's workshop, but for God, where he's, designing everything and building it the way that a human would. That's silly. There's no need for that hypothesis, right? There's a process that can produce this. It's a natural process, the process of evolution.
It is interesting. I mean, one of the big things that stops me from being a theist is the problem of evil. And if you begin to posit the idea that there is a God that's behind something like evolution, got to kind of start asking the question, kind of, if this is the process that was selected out of, you imagine other better processes that would have been possible because God is theoretically all powerful, all knowing, all loving, etc., etc. It's quite a brutal way to bring about sentient beings, to then wipe them off the face of the earth, to bring another group about to wipe them off the face of the earth through extremely painful and arbitrary processes. It's all theoretically to bring about Homo sapien. I don't know. I find the whole thing really strange. Anyway, that's probably one for another conversation.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I'm not religious either, so I don't know how to respond to questions like that. There is this big group of Christians who accept evolution, and they do see evolution as the process that God used to create. How it is that they justify just the mass suffering. Evolution is a super wasteful process, right? Like tons of organisms die and suffer. They're born with defects and so on. And that's an essential part of the evolutionary process because, as you mentioned earlier, there are more ways to be dead than to be alive. And there's a lot more ways to have a negative mutation than a positive mutation. And those negative mutations get weeded out. But that's a painful, horrible process. So how it is that people align that with like a Christian God, for example, I don't know. I mean, one way that I would say, if I had to defend that position, is just like, well, you're assuming that you know better than God, right? That's what a lot of people will respond to. But I don't know how to square those two, but people do it, so
must be possible. I mean, yeah, people square all sorts of like weird stuff, right? So I'm not annoyed at people doing that. I do think that the story in Genesis, the early sort of first sort of primordial chapters of Genesis, the first 9, where God just creates stuff out of the dust, sounds like it's less painful, less awful. But anyway,
it does sound less painful. But
so I've I've got 3 videos. I want to watch 2 little sections of each of them in turn and then chat about them with you, John. The first one's actually one of your videos, so I'm going to actually make you listen to yourself, which is quite funny.
All right.
I think it would be good for people to dive into this with us. So, okay, so we're going to listen to 2 parts from these 3 videos. So, John, we're going to start with this one. How do bee stingers work, from your beautiful channel, Stated Clearly. So let me play the first few seconds, and then I'll move towards the end of the clip, and then we can chat this through.
This is what the end of a honeybee stinger looks like under an electron microscope. Notice those wicked backward-facing barbs. Here's an animated diagram of the entire stinger. Muscles, venom sac, venom pumps, and all. When you look at this, you might be thinking, no way, that's fake. Surely a bee stinger isn't this complex, right? Today we'll compare this diagram to actual footage of honeybee stingers, footage like this right here, and we'll look at several high-resolution images taken with electron microscopes. Stated Clearly presents How Do Bee Stingers Work? For now, though, let's just take a moment here to stop and appreciate what a fantastic contraption the stinger is. From a bee's perspective, you are Godzilla. In those films, Godzilla is impervious to our greatest weapons, yet the amount of pain a single bee can deliver with just one sting? Well, unless you're used to it, that's usually enough to ruin a person's day. On top of that, if you happen to be extremely allergic, which is super rare, mind you, I don't want to trigger a panic here, but if you do happen to be extremely allergic, a single sting can kill you. That is impressive. Now, normally I try not to brag, but I gotta say, I am proud of the diagram I've been showing you here. It's currently the most accurate animated stinger diagram on the internet. This is an updated version of the one I published back in 2014. Someday I'll do a third update to show how all the articulations and individual muscles work, but this current update highlights how the pump valves slide past to replace each other when in use. This ability was first described in 1910 by entomologist R.E. Snodgrass. I dedicate this diagram to him. This new version also highlights a structure which, to my knowledge, has never been described before. Right here is a joint called the basal articulation, which has been officially described. If we look at the stinger from a side view, we can see how it works. This joint lets the stinger swing forward and backward. This joint is found in the ovipositors and stingers of many types of ants, bees, and wasps. But in some species, honeybees included, the bases of the condyles in this joint seem to have taken on a second function. They appear to act as a zipper head or girdle, which zips the lancet shafts together down the midline as they pass through that girdle. It's a really neat mechanism. Bees are not the only ones that seem to have this girdle. Here's the same thing in the stinger of a digger wasp. I'm currently in conversations with several researchers to see if this girdle function has ever been described before in the scientific literature. If not, and if the girdle actually works the way that I think it does, it should be officially described. It's a beautiful example of what Stephen Jay Gould called an exaptation. Evolution often generates new functional structures by simply modifying or expanding old structures.
So, just obviously that's first and foremost, it's a plug for your channel. It is just absolutely fantastic. It goes into such great detail, beautiful diagrams, great voice, and amazing sound effects like the zipper sound effect and the sparkly sounds effects. Beautiful. I love it. Yeah. I wanted to share that as a really interesting example of something that is really, really complicated, but was originally intended for a different purpose and has slowly kind of been utilized and shifted, and it's moved along in its function bit by bit by bit. So, I mean, theists are going to find things like this and they're going to be blown away and they'll be praising God for this sort of creation, as we mentioned, the sort of sunset analogy. But I'd be interested, John, just to kind of pass back to you to explore something like the honeybee stinger and how it has shifted gradually bit by bit by bit by bit into what we see today with the stinger of a bee, and what that means and how that came about through the process of evolution.
Yeah. So the bee stinger evolved from an ovipositor. So female insects, a lot of them have this structure. There's actually 6 parts to it. There are 6 little projections from their exoskeleton. And in some of them, they kind of fold against each other. They merge to form this really intricate tube with interlocking parts. Some of them are a lot simpler, right? And we think that this evolved probably starting from either, 6 little scraping structures that would help them scrape the ground and then lay eggs in the ground, or possibly just 6 little hair-like structures that would help guide the egg to whatever location where they were trying to lay that egg. And over evolutionary time, it got more, those 6 structures became more entangled with each other until you have, in some species, they can dig into the ground with it and they move it just like you see the stinger moving there. There's the different parts move and it lets them dig a hole in the ground. They lay their eggs in there. Some even have little teeth on them and they can saw into plants. And then in wasps, we see that not only are they digging into plants, some of them dig into, sawflies, which are related to wasps, some of them can dig into hard wood with their ovipositor. And it looks a lot like the stinger of a bee. They drill by, they've got that rod in the back that they stick into the wood, and then they have the 2 digging blades that just smash into that wood and just saw into it, and they can lay their eggs inside that wood. Others have started laying their eggs inside of flesh. So there's a lot of wasps that will lay their eggs inside of aphids. Aphids are a really nice, easy target to lay your eggs inside of because they can't really move. When an aphid is eating, its face is stuck in the plant, and it's slow at removing its face from the plant and trying to run away. So they're just easy targets. They're just sitting there. So you get this gradual transition from an egg-laying device to a weapon. And there's a bunch of different little innovations that happen along that pathway. And we can see these through comparative anatomy. It's very, very obvious. Even Snodgrass, back when he first wrote about it, he understood. He gave a very loose model of how this could have evolved just using comparative anatomy. And since then, it's so obvious. The stinger of a bee is a modified ovipositor. And in fact, queen bees still sort of use theirs for laying eggs. The egg doesn't come out the middle of the stinger like it does in other animals that still lay their eggs fully through the ovipositor, but they will still use their ovipositors kind of like a finger, you could say. They'll stick it to the egg and like move the egg around if they laid it in the wrong spot. So it's really neat to see. The other little bit of evidence for this is that, of course, male bees do not have stingers because males don't have ovipositors. And so it's only the females that have stingers, the worker females, and then the queen that has a stinger. So yeah, this fantastic contraption evolved through exaptation. It started out as something that was either being used to scrape the ground and lay eggs or sort of guide the eggs, a very simple structure. That became more and more complex as it was, and it ended up being useful for different things, for digging into the ground or for digging into plants, eventually for digging into living animals. And then we also have, along with that, we have the coevolution of venom. Venom evolved from what we call an accessory gland. These are glands that produce liquids that are excreted with the egg. That some of them might have like an antibiotic behavior. They might just act as lubricant to help the egg come out easier. And one of those glands evolved into the venom gland that we have in bees, probably during this part in their evolution where they were starting to lay eggs in living animals and having a little something in that liquid that subdued the animal, calmed it down, or paralyzed it in some way. That was helpful. And now we have the full-on venom. So yeah, this gradual process, this zigzag in evolutionary history. It started out for laying eggs, and then it started being used as a weapon. That's how we get the stinger of the bee.
If you're watching this, then I just wanted to let you know that you can access the same content in audio-only form by subscribing via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Audible. In fact, you can search for the Socratic Sessions in your favourite podcast app, and whilst you're there, please leave a 5-star review. It helps others to discover these conversations. All links are in the description, and thank you. Evolution is mind-blowing, isn't it? You can understand why people sit there and just go, this is awe-inspiring. I do kind of often wonder, and I said this right at the introduction, John, so you weren't there for this, but I feel like sometimes atheists, naturalists, whatever language you want to use, sometimes lose the awe and wonder of evolution. They just kind of go, oh yeah, it's just this process and we're here and that's cool. But like it is incredible that these things can come about and that they have come about and that there's been these different little kind of steps on the journey to get from one place to the other. This zigzag that you're mentioning here, it's just mind blowing. Do you think it's fair to say that oftentimes people almost get over evolution too quickly?
I don't know. I have seen in some of these debates between creationists, especially people online, people who aren't real biologists, but they want to defend evolution. A lot of times you'll see them downplaying how spectacular a specific adaptation is. I do not do that at all. These things are amazing. The sting of a bee is absolutely spectacular. And if you listen to biologists talk about it, a lot of times, they're just awestruck as well by these structures. But they understand the process. And I guess when you understand the process of something, maybe you're not going to be so dumbfounded, I suppose. But I don't know. For me, I love it. I love studying these structures. I love seeing how they evolved. For me, that just adds to it, actually. But maybe it's true that people try to downplay. When people get stuck in these debates, one of the tactics that they use, which I think is just dumb, is they try and downplay how amazing these structures are. They are amazing. The stinger of a bee is absolutely spectacular. The bacterial flagellum, very spectacular. The most complicated things on Earth, the human brain, we don't even know fully how it works. And evolution built it. It's wild what this process can do. It's deceptively simple, the process, but when it plays out, the dynamics that emerge are just insane.
And often we kind of begin to discover things through kind of whatever it is within the world, within, it could be mechanics or something else, and then we kind of begin to look at evolution. We realize that it's already been discovered. We're just rediscovering it within some sort of kind of space within the evolutionary kind of sphere, and we've just kind of created this thing we thought was really cool. Like you think of something like sonar, for instance. We think we're really clever for creating different sorts of sonar, but then you look at things like bats and echolocation and things like this, and it's so finely tuned. It's absolutely incredible. Like we're nowhere near that. It's
Well, if you think of some of the earliest machines, like levers and pulleys and all these crazy systems, well, all of that's in your hand. There's just amazing, like the way that the tendons are structured and they're all connected. And it's your hand is a machine. It's a beautiful machine. Very well. It's amazing to look at these things.
Yeah, it's great. Okay, let's move on to the next video. Make sure my audio is working again. So this is a video from another great YouTube channel, Smarter Every Day, a guy called Destin. So this one's all about a bacterial flagella motor. So we're going to watch two little clips from this. Again, it'll be another couple of minutes. So listener, viewer, listen into this.
I was on the internet the other day. I was just scrolling on my phone. I was probably wasting too much time. But I came across this amazing animation that blew my mind. It's a motor that appears to be made out of molecules. And I'm a mechanical engineer. When I saw this thing, I was like, that's a motor. Like, that's a spinny thing that has a power source. It has an axle of some sort, and it is moving. Furthermore, this one, I have a little switch here, can reverse directions, which is amazing. So I thought, I've got to get to the bottom of this, because the implications for a biomechanical motor are insane. Now, specifically, the thing this is called a flagellar motor. You may have heard of the flagellum on the back of sperm or on bacteria. That's what this is. A flagellum is that whippy thing in the single cellular organism that helps provide locomotion, but I've never thought about that thing has to spin, which means it has to have like a shaft it rotates around. It's just, the implications are wild. So the more I got to reading about this flagellar motor is what it's called.
The sperm actually works different. It's a totally different structure. It wiggles back and forth. It kind of whips a little bit, but it actually doesn't rotate at the base. But he's right that it's a spectacular structure on the sperm as well. They're just different, but just point that out real quick.
Nice. Yeah, no, it's good.
The more I realized this is a really big topic, not only in biomechanics and things like that, but in philosophy. Like the complexity of a flagellar motor implies many things about the origin of life. And I'm not going to answer that in this video, but it raises questions that people are debating, and they're talking about, how can this be? It's so complex. And well, you don't understand the time involved with how this came. All this is fascinating. So there are implications for the fact that something so complex exists and is so integral to the creation of human life. I mean, this is fascinating stuff. So it also opens up a huge debate. People say, well, how can something this complex come to be out of nothing? The logic goes like this. If this motor system is composed of complex individual parts, and all these parts work together to perform the overall function of rotating, then how did the individual parts come to be? Did it all have to happen at the same time? Or is there some evolutionary advantage to the cell for every intermediate stage of development? Is 15% of this motor advantageous to the cell? What function would 50% of the structure perform? What were the steps these components took to assemble into such a complex molecular machine in the first place? Scientists are trying to figure this out, and I encourage you to read their papers. Many seem to be focusing on the type 3 secretion system, which works like a hypodermic needle that a cell can use to inject other things. This device looks similar, but it's quite different in its protein structure. The complexity and origin of the bacterial flagellar motor is a really interesting conundrum. As I was a younger man and I would read things on the internet, I would find people saying, hey, you got to believe all this over here. Or people would say, hey, you got to believe all this over here. There's a big war going on. It's between science and faith, and you're either in one camp or the other. Get your flag and figure out where you're going to put your flag. And the more
Anyway, this is it's a fantastic video. It'll be linked in the description. I encourage people to check out both Destin's channel and this video, and to obviously do your own research as well, like watch the whole thing. We're just providing clips here just for time. But just to kind of dive in very briefly, John, so kind of Destin's comments seem to suggest that we don't know how flagella could have evolved. And you've already kind of touched on this briefly, that kind of scientists are kind of postulating two kind of potential ways of kind of going into this. Do you want to dive into that a little bit more again, or should we push on to other questions?
Yeah, well, so Destin mentioned, well, okay, first of all, his video is great. Like, people should watch that video. Some people emailed me after that was published, like, hey, he's promoting some creationist stuff. And he does there kind of at the end. He's like, how could this evolve? And he suggests that he doesn't believe that it could evolve. I don't think he actually says he believes it couldn't evolve, but he mentions a couple of papers. But I think that Destin somehow missed all of the, like, he dug into some of the nitty-gritty, like, individual papers on the origin of flagella, but he somehow missed the review papers that actually outline the step-by-step process of how flagella evolved, how flagella likely evolved or possibly could have evolved. So evolutionary biologists, they do two big things. One is they observe evolution happening now, and they try to figure out better and better how it actually works. Now, the basics of evolution, as I said, are very simple. There's descent with modification acted upon by selection, but the dynamics that emerge from that are really complicated. So evolutionary biologists study those dynamics. How is it that these things evolve? How are things evolving today? And then with that information, they look at structures to figure out how they evolved, the actual history behind that. And it's kind of like when you build a model, you'll see like models that historians build on how the pyramids were built, right? And there's a lot of speculation in these models. Like with pyramids, for example, they're like, okay, the Egyptians had copper. They had these sets of tools we know. How are they drilling and cutting stone the way that they did? And then they'll try and figure that out, because we don't have a lot of the tools. The copper was either stolen or decayed. There's copper copper tools don't stick around that long as these structures did. So you have to kind of figure out, you have to be creative with this and figure out how would people be doing this. And you come up with a model. It doesn't tell you exactly how the pyramids were built, but it tells you how they were likely built. And we do this. This is what we do with things like bacterial flagella. We don't have a fossil record for the origin of flagella because our fossils are not that detailed. We can tell it when there were bacteria, but we can't tell the individual structures on those bacteria. So we have to do some pretty, it's complicated to build these models, but we do have them. And we have models that explain how the bacterial flagella could have evolved, start to finish. We have those already. Scientists are still debate like details, like of the many different pathways evolution could have taken, which is the most likely one. And to figure that out, we study the genes that are involved, the different proteins that are there, which of these genes evolved through duplication events followed by selection, which parts of this evolved for different functions that then came together to produce a new function. Stuff like that is still being, debated, but we do have these models. They already exist.
I guess part of the sort of appeal to dropping a video like this on bacterial flagella motors is that it kind of posits, or people believe that there's sort of these spaces that posit conundrums or problems for claiming that there are naturalistic evolutionary origins to everything. Like people are almost trying to look for the thing that's going to stump us and make it so that we go, oh, actually, maybe our entire theory is incorrect because there is this one thing that is impossible to or have evolved. There's a kind of really good kind of comedy sketch by a guy called Jon Perry, who's a UK comedian over here, and he's got this great sort of kind of a few radio series, and in one of those he has like a little kind of like 3-minute sketch on evolution. He goes, evolution is tried and tested. We know it's not just a theory; it's a fact now, etc., etc. Although there is that one thing that causes us challenges, and they're like, oh, what's that? It's like the hummingbird. I mean, the damn thing flies backwards. Oh, and there is the other thing as well, which is my granddaughter. She couldn't possibly be a Anyway, so there's sort of these these still classic tropes around. There is always something that we don't want evolution to explain, or evolution we believe can't explain. Do you think there are actually, obviously apart from my children, are there actually any things that are currently out there that we think do pose or posit a massive problem for evolution? And just to stall you before we go, the final clip we're going to look at is abiogenesis, which is a big conundrum in and of itself. So we'll tackle that one separately. But anything in the evolutionary landscape, John?
As far as you're asking if there are any things that are like, we have no clue how that could have evolved.
Yeah.
Not once you have the full process of evolution going, it's incredibly powerful. So there are lots of things that we don't have models for. We don't. So the bacterial flagellum, we do have a model for its evolution. For their evolution, there's lots of versions of the flagella. But that's one that people have actually worked on. But of course, there's tons of things that nobody's worked on. I mean, there's millions of different types of animals, and millions and millions of different organisms and structures. The vast majority we have not even, tried to build models for, because there's just too many of them, which is kind of funny because as soon as you answer one of these questions, people will say, well, okay, well, what about, and they just give you another one. So people who don't want to accept evolution, they have basically an infinite supply of things to fall back on if they want to. They can play that game as long as they want. But yeah, flagella, we've got pretty solid models for now. And actually, I sent you a paper, and I'm forgetting the name of that. I thought I wrote it down here, but yes, I did send you a paper on that, which is that it was a review written in 2020. That's a really nice one. It's called Propulsive Nanomachines: The Convergent Evolution of Archaea, Flagella, and Cilia. And so that actually goes over really in depth the structure of all of these different these swimming organelles. and it goes over their evolution, their evolutionary models. And they actually took one of the flagella evolutionary models and they drew it out. They drew out all the major steps, and they explain what's in between those steps as well in the paper. It's a really good paper. And I'm going to send that to Destin. I'm actually working on a little mini series on Stated Casually, responding to Destin's video, because he asked specifically, what's the point of half of a flagella? What's the point of 15% of a flagella? And those questions are actually answered in this paper. Just, it's already been sitting there on the internet since 2020. But these models, people have been working on them for a long time. I think probably they first started talking about this in the 80s. And then some really solid ones were developed in like 2006, I think, is when or 2003 was when one was published online. It was actually a biologist who just posted it. It wasn't even like a peer-reviewed thing. He just posted it because he was frustrated that people were arguing about this so much on the internet. So he just posted a really solid one. And that's actually been cited by a lot of papers now. And this 2020 version, they mention his model. And that's partly what the one they illustrated is based on. But anyway, it's a great paper, really good paper. And it goes over all the different flagella, their structure, and their evolution. So people should check that out if they want to learn more.
Okay, I'll make sure there's the link to that in the description as well. That's it's really helpful. Okay, we're going to dive into the third and final clip now.
Yeah.
So this one is on a Theist's YouTube channel, a guy called Matt Fradd, who has a podcast / YouTube channel called Pints with Aquinas. So this is with Dr. Jon Bergsma. I think I'm not butchering his name. And this is talking about abiogenesis. Abiogenesis, for those who don't know, is the theory that life on Earth starts from non-living matter. And it poses a conundrum for how non-living matter assembles itself into living matter, and then we kind of get we get the start of evolution from that, right? So again, I'm going to play 2 clips from this, so there'll be another kind of 3 or 4 minutes now. So I'll hit play.
On the origin of life, I think this is a good book. Stephen Meyer. You said you might want to get him on the show sometime.
Yeah,
I think
Stephen, if you're watching.
Awesome, if we could. Yeah, Signature in the Cell is his discussion about the mystery of the origin of life and many other things. So let's talk about origin of life. So it is hard to define life, but we do have a sense of what we mean when we say a living thing. That's not a vacuous statement.
Right.
And then the question is, where do living things come from? How they arise? And this is a big conundrum, because essentially, when we recreate the conditions of the early Earth under which presumably life arose, and we know that life appeared, okay, but when we recreate those initial conditions, they do not conduce to the chemistry that is necessary for a living thing to come into existence.
Okay.
So, we can recreate the atmosphere of the early Earth. We can recreate what we think the early oceans might be. We can do that in a laboratory and create this artificial environment. And then we just leave it and watch it. And what happens? A whole lot of nothing. Okay. And so well, nothing's happening. So let's create some excitement. So let's stimulate lightning, right? Let's create some lightning zaps. And lightning also creates a whole lot of nothing. Now, folks might say, well, I thought we could get amino acids from lightning. Well, okay. This goes back to a famous experiment called the Urey-Miller experiment. Miller and Urey created what they believed to be the atmosphere and the conditions of the early Earth, and then they put electrical pulses through it to stimulate simulate lightning, and they got a bunch of amino acids. Not all the amino acids that we need, but they got a bunch of them, and that was really cool. And that is basically the last advance that we've had in origin of life research. To this day, when we simulate the conditions of the early Earth and maybe shoot simulated lightning through it or whatever, we can't get beyond amino acids. Like, now I probably should explain what amino acids are, how they.
Well, can I just comment there?
Please, yeah.
That guy is completely butchering science. There's been massive advances in origin of life research since the Miller-Urey experiment. It's just been ongoing. There's just been success after success after success. What's true is that we don't have a pathway from the origin of life, from prebiotic chemistry all the way to the origin of life that works start to finish. We don't have a model for that even yet. There's still a bunch of gaps in our understanding. So that is, it's true that this problem's not solved, but it's not true that we haven't had success since the Miller-Urey experiment. There's tons of, we've learned all about RNA, like the RNA world hypothesis is totally new since then. All these RNA experiments where we get this amazing evolution of RNA, if we, when we simulate these environments, that those are not prebiotically plausible. So there's gaps between what we know can work and what we think would need to have happened on the early Earth. But we've been making steady progress at closing those gaps since this research started. And the Miller-Urey experiment was the first of many experiments that explored this process. So
that's helpful. That's really helpful. No, thank you, John. All right, let's watch the last, I think it's like 1 minute and 15 seconds or something, then we'll jump back into this.
Mm-hmm.
Life. We know that life arose. We know that it can't happen by natural means. We know that laws of physics and chemistry alone won't do it. We know that life requires a lot of intelligence. This is the argument that Meyer makes in this book. We need those instructions. We need those Lego instructions.
He's simply positing that. Those aren't, that's not true. Yeah.
Yep, I agree. I just thought it'd be good just to dive into it and just to hear him what he has to say. He's basically going to turn around and say that we need God, right? That's what it's all about.
Yeah. Well, so what we don't have at the origin of life, the process of evolution, of Darwinian evolution, which is descent with modification acted upon by selection, we don't have reproduction at the origin of life. So we can't just say that that's how it worked. That's why this is so difficult. What we need is to understand how the first replicator came about. How did the first thing that can make copies of itself come about? And that's a very difficult question. And you can't just lean on Darwinian evolution to answer that question, because Darwinian evolution requires replication in order to work. So that's why these other processes have been discovered. These other processes that the chemical evolution processes where chemical systems will change in their content over time. Those are being studied. There's all sorts of different environments that have been simulated, microenvironments. I mean, we're talking about the entire Earth with all of its little microenvironments. Somewhere there, it is hard to simulate an entire planet in a lab and to be able to watch what's happening at this microscopic scale. So it's a very difficult problem to solve, the origin of life, but people are working on it and they're making progress. So basically these people are exaggerating the lack of progress. So he exaggerates the lack of progress there at the start. And then he's just saying, oh, this is a hard problem. People haven't figured it out. Therefore, it's a miracle. That's just, sure, you can say that. You could say that I don't understand how lightning works. Therefore, Zeus makes lightning. But someday, it's not a very good assumption to make if you're trying to figure out how it actually works, because you're going to stop looking. Yeah. And then it's just, I feel like it's a bad idea to base your faith on that, because someday someone's going to figure out how lightning works, and then your faith in Zeus will be destroyed. So I just don't think it's a very good idea to play these God of the Gaps games and then have that be the foundation of your faith. So unwise, but
Yeah, there seems to be like a sort of kind of pairing going on here. This idea of kind of supernatural intervention and then God of the gaps, where we don't necessarily have the answers. So we're going to just posit that there is this thing that can come in and kind of lift us from point zero to point one or whatever it is and begin life on its journey. Yeah. I guess it might just be really, really helpful, John, just to kind of hammer this last one home, and then we can kind of close, which is kind of why it is obviously frustrating and bad that people begin to posit a supernatural designer to answer these sorts of things and fail to address the root of the problem, which is kind of actually, is there a method that non-living matter could accumulate into living matter and we could have the building blocks for life as we know it? And I'm the kind of frustration that I have with this is almost as if it suggests we should just stop looking, that we should just assume that this is the answer and give up. I think it's Perry Marshall that has a sort of a fund of money that he's going to give to somebody who's able to actually kind of prove that there is a way that kind of non-life can get into the state of kind of living biological matter. I think, Perry's a sort of kind of a theist. He believes in something called Evolution 2.0, which we won't bore the listener with here in this conversation, John, but there just seems to be this desire to kind of say God did it, and then it's impossible for people to kind of go, no, he didn't, because we don't have the answers at this point. That doesn't mean we won't have the answers. I don't know. It just gets my hackles up. So I'll pass it back to you to have your closing thoughts on it.
Well, I was talking earlier about with evolutionary models. I was saying that this is very similar to building a model as to how did the Egyptians build the pyramids, right? We're lacking a bunch of information, so we can't know for sure. So we have to build these models that can tell us how they might have done it. And then you've got all these people on the sidelines saying, they didn't, it was aliens. That's very similar to what we're seeing here. You've got biologists and biochemists who are working on models for the origin of life. Those models there's gaps in those models. And so you got all these people on the sidelines saying it was aliens, or in this case, it was God. It's very, very similar. Well, is it possible that aliens built the pyramids? I mean, it's possible, right? But what would you need to do to prove that? Well, you should be looking at, instead of just saying that the pyramids are complex, therefore aliens, why don't you look for actual evidence of the aliens themselves, right? You could do that. The creationists are not doing that. They're not looking for positive evidence of God. They're just saying, this is complicated. Scientists haven't figured it out. Therefore, Jesus. And that's just it's lazy science, right? If you think that there was a creator, go find actual positive evidence of that creator, instead of just saying that if scientists can't figure this out, therefore it's our story. That's what happened here. So that's my frustration with it. I'd love to see these creationists actually put together a research program to find God, right? That would be interesting, to find evidence of God, actual positive evidence of God. I think from a Christian theological perspective, though, that's probably against the rules. That's what caused God to mess up everyone's language in the Tower of Babel story, right? So I think Christianity has biblical reasons to not want to put together a research program to look for God, I guess. That's kind of frustrating. But yeah, these types of arguments are not, I don't find them impressive or interesting. They're just, it's just lazy science, I would say.
Yeah, but I think it's kind of almost just an extreme view of what we touched on right at the start, which is this idea of, I'm pregnant with a baby. Obviously, God's real. There just seems to be this desire for gods to be woven into the narrative, and no matter where you look, we just aren't seeing that isn't kind of coming to the fore. Sure, you can have a sort of God that is really, really kind of far back from it all, that kind of hit go, maybe, that cause the parameters of the sort of universe to be as they are for life to emerge, and isn't actively involved. That's a completely different kind of kettle of fish to saying that there is a God that is deliberately bringing about through the process of evolution specific things at specific times. It just seems to be, I don't know, claiming stuff that we don't have evidence for. It's just hope rather than fact. And I kind of really hope that this conversation has been a nice kind of introduction for somebody that might be on the fence of this or wanting to explore this kind of honestly, to begin to look at what evolution is, what the mechanisms are behind evolution, and how life can begin to adapt and change and mutate and move down various different avenues to go reach different peaks at different time periods, for us to be able to have this conversation, to be able to create a podcast like this, to be able to have friendships and love and family and these sorts of things. How when you actually begin to look at why these things are embedded within us, there isn't a God behind the scenes, like there isn't a magician behind the curtain like in The Wizard of Oz. There is just evolution. I don't know, John, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think one thing that I've noticed in my career is that this problem of teaching evolution is very interesting. Yeah, I teach chemistry as well. When you're teaching chemistry, you don't have this problem where it's not just that people have trouble understanding because it's difficult. They actively don't want to understand it. And it's very frustrating as a biology, teaching biology, like, yeah, your students actively are trying to misunderstand you, which super frustrating. And there are these well-funded organizations that are also trying to deliberately teach people wrong. I don't think that problem's going to go away anytime soon. It seems like fundamentally people are disturbed by this idea that there's not this. One thing that religion gives people is this very strong sense of cosmic purpose. Like, not only do I have the purposes of my life that I've built, I woke up today to do this podcast, right? That's my purpose for today. But there's a cosmic purpose for a Christian, which is to serve God, or there's some sort of a God-given purpose as well. People really like that. If you get rid of religion, you don't have that, and that is very disturbing to a lot of people. And I think that it's kind of that that's at the base of a lot of this confusion around evolution. People don't want to believe it because they feel like it gets rid of their sense of cosmic purpose. And yeah, I don't know how to help people with that, because it is just how it is. We are here because we evolved, and yeah, that's just part of the reality. So
yeah, I kind of find reading more and actually engaging with other worldviews to be really beneficial. See things from another person's perspective, even if it doesn't feel like home, even if it challenges you. Like, I find the idea of something called godless normative realism to be really, really tricky to get my head around, which is the idea that there are moral kind of objective facts about reality, but there isn't a God that kind of instantiates these things. And kind of with my theist hat from back in the day on, that doesn't make any sense. I just don't understand that. But the more I begin to read about moral objective facts or values or properties, whatever language you want to use, the more I'm being challenged in my old way of thinking, and the more that I'm kind of beginning to realize that those shoes that I once kind of wore to view things through that were really tight and uncomfortable begin to make more and more sense, more and more worn, I guess, as a good pair of slippers would be. Anyway, it's interesting. I find that to be quite a helpful tool. John, before I let you go, where would you want people to go to find you online, to engage with your work? Is YouTube the best place, or is there somewhere else?
Yeah, well, I have a website, statedclearly.com, which people can go to. That's where all my animations are like put up and organized. And then, of course, my YouTube channel, it's YouTube/Stated Clearly. And then if you want to hear more long form stuff, like kind of talks and presentations and lectures, those are on Stated Casually. And that's where I'm going to be doing the series about Destin's video. Well, I'll just be responding to that and talking about the evolution of the bacterial flagella. So,
sweet. Well, if that's out by the time this is out, because there'll be a few weeks delay, then I'll make sure it's linked in the description. But even if it's been a few years' time and that's been released, again, I'll come back and put it into the description. So when that's out, John, make sure you pass it over to me. And mate, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the new show. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks. That was fun.
Thanks for checking out this episode. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And make sure you check us out over on Locals. Cheers.